My guest tonight is Jay Dyer. He returns to the show. Hey, Jay, how you doing?
Hey, Tim.
Listen, well, thanks for coming on the show again. Of course, Jay is the host of Jay's Analysis, and also Esoteric Hollywood, correct?
Correct, yes.
And you have a book coming out by that name in a few months, right?
Yes, by June, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film should be available, and that will be a lot of my top film reviews and others that people haven't seen.
And well, tonight I wanted to discuss. Well, you did a show a while back regarding MK Ultra and the Manchurian Candidate, John Mark's book, but also the broader issue, MK Ultra and mind control.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk to you about that today. Of course, MK Ultra was the CIA's research into human behavior or manipulating human behavior. It officially began in 1953, but I think it dates as early as back as 1950 under the moniker Bluebird.
Correct.
Then it became Artichoke, then MK Ultra, then MK Search, I think was the final official name. Basically, well, MK Ultra, Mind Control. What was that program? Let's hear your take on it.
Sure. Well, I want to preface too by saying that I do agree and have thought myself many times that once you do a good bit of research in these kinds of fields, you start to realize that, well, a lot of these even so-called exposés are allowed exposés. So just because we're reading, somebody's expose on the CIA or whatever, does not necessarily mean that it's going to have all the dirt. It's only going to have the dirt that is allowed to be out. And one of the reasons that we know that is that I read some years ago John Marx's other book that he wrote with Victor Marchetti, which is the CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, which is somewhat dated now. But you can tell that you're dealing with people who are obviously in this world. So the information that's coming out is going to be somewhat censored. I mean, that book itself includes a whole bunch of black lines and so forth. But that can actually kind of be a PR thing that helps sell books when you get black lines in your book, marking out things, because then it has the impression of, juicy info that nobody knows. But nevertheless, I still think that we can gain quite a bit from these books regardless, even if they're watered down and controlled. They do still tell a pretty good overall picture of what's going on. And so I read Marx's book last summer. And it is worth recapping and looking at. And I did do, yeah, you're right, I did that talk on that people can check out. But so for this, I think we have to go back to the military. And even prior to the military, we have to look at Huxley and his circle and the Tavistock Institute and so forth. So it's kind of Huxley, I think you could argue, that was sort of nascent in getting the generic plan of what would be MK Ultra going. So Huxley was promoting the ergots and these different hallucinogens, prior to Time Magazine and prior to MK Ultra and prior to the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Corporation and so forth, and Gordon Wasson and these characters. And Huxley thought that this could really bring about a revolution, at least so he said. But the revolution that he's talking about, that he describes in his famous introduction to Brave New World, is not a revolution that is going to really free people. This is a revolution, the final revolution of the technocrats. And that is an excellent element that Marx does bring out in his book. So he will talk about the fact that when you get into the 40s, according to Marx, it's into the 40s that the military started thinking what we need to do is figure out a way to make people more docile, malleable, and controllable, even to the point in chapter 3 we have discussions of getting rid of free will. So the military was interested in saying, well, could we create a soldier who actually had no free will? That's important because that's exactly what Bertrand Russell said in his works. He said, in the future, what we're going to need is a society of people that don't have the functioning of free will. In fact, it needs to be stamped out. And with other British intelligence types like George Orwell, Eric Blair, this is exactly what we see O'Brien telling Winston in 1984. He says, I'm here to stamp out your human spirit, to get rid of your free will. I'm going to put my boot on your face forever. So when we look at impact of science on society in these works of Bertrand Russell, that's kind of the premier technocrat that we could find, and that's going to tie into what we're going to talk about later on in the interview with scientism and technocracy. But I want to point out that that's the beginning of the mindset behind the people who would be doing MK Ultra. So that was a great point that not a lot of people talk about, that Marx brings out, and that's relevant because it's not, as you said, about creating these mind control couriers and so forth so much as it is how can this be applied on a mass scale. And it's precisely with these early military tests that they started to realize that, all right, we need a drug that could, initially they wanted a truth serum, right? So they were looking for something that could work to, you get the enemy to divulge secrets or whatever. So they tried things like pot and different narcotics, and those didn't work out too well because I guess everybody just got the munchies and was eating Fritos and Fritos. They weren't really telling the government secrets. So the idea was hatched. I should add too that a lot of the early on guys in this were connected to the OSS, and so the OSS, of course, features people like Roald Dahl, who would write Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, right? So it was Roald Dahl with Ian Fleming and William Stevenson, who would be instrumental in helping the Americans set up their so-called national security apparatus, where in 1942 the OSS is created, and then in 1947 you have the National Security Council and the CIA being created out of the OSS. And so it's Bill Donovan, working with all these British PSYOP masters to create this agency that would be involved in these kinds of covert operations, all under the guise, of course, of keeping America free and keeping America safe and extending American foreign policy into countries that were supposedly hostile to the U.S. and our so-called freedoms. That, however, is not ultimately what this agency would be doing and being involved in. It would ultimately be involved in drug trafficking and mind control and black operations, covert operations, regime changes, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody probably has a basic idea of that kind of stuff that the CIA does. But what they started realizing was that these different drugs, going back in the 40s or late 40s and 50s, that they were testing troops on, that you could get all kinds of different effects with these different with these different drugs. And it's a particular character by the name of Gordon Wasson who would begin to figure prominently in this, who also worked with J.P. Morgan and yet had these government ties as well, where he was hatched this plan of, actually, because he was into there's a term for the study of mushrooms that escapes me at the moment, but he was really into mushrooms. So, and he and his wife would take these trips down to Mexico and different countries in Latin America, South America, wherever, and they started realizing that, actually, the techniques of the shamans, and this is what other writers who've written on MK Ultra point out, is that they kind of looked at indigenous religions, and they would kind of do these ethnographies of the indigenous religions, and they say, the shaman seems to have a lot of power through what he can do, and this is where you get people like Carlos Castaneda, working with different universities to kind of do the same thing that was going on, and with the ideas of the Wassons and the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Corporation and so forth. And Jay Stevens' book touches on this as well, Storming Heaven, the story of LSD. And so the CIA, then what they would do is kind of contract, and now the CIA, of course, is early on is quite a few Air Force people, right? So this is where the military element comes into it. So they would contract with different pharmaceutical outfits to produce this new lysosyl diethylamide that was derived from the ergot and these different psilocybin, these mushrooms and so forth. And so they started running these tests on different soldiers, and as you pointed out, this is where we get the transition from bluebird to artichoke. And this is going on at places like Fort Detrick and other bases, and they're kind of running these backroom tests on soldiers. And then the idea is hatched to I should point out, by the way, that Josiah Macy of the Macy Foundation was also involved in putting money into this operation. So here you have a direct connect between Sandoz, Macy's, J.P. Gordon Wasson working with J.P. Morgan. Here's the corporate, so-called private sector, hand in hand with the so-called public government sector.
It's a public-private partnership.
Exactly. So what happened was they started running these tests on these unfortunate soldiers, and then they got the idea, well, why don't we branch out into places like universities? And this is what most people don't know, is that MK Ultra is not this secret underground base experiment type thing. It's going on at your local university. It was a lot of university professors, psychologists, and so forth that are really taking part in this, more so than some hooded James Bond type figure, cloak and dagger types. It's more so a university and psychiatric world that is the locus of MK Ultra. I think it was some 40 plus universities were involved in this program, and Marx mentions places like, what is it? He says Boston Psychopathic, Mount Sinai Hospital at Columbia University, Carl Pfeiffer, University of Illinois Medical School, Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Louis Jolyon West, one of the prominent doctors, was at the University of Oklahoma, University of Rochester, and so forth and so on. And we have this list of just countless so-called government facilities and mental institutes that are the locus of what would be MK Ultra. And what they started realizing was that massive doses of this lysosomal diethylamide would create schizophrenia, and you would get disassociation. You would get people in altered states, mind splitting, and so forth. There's a that 70s film that's kind of interesting that touches on this, where they're actually doing the experiments, I think, at a university. Is it not Jeff Daniels? Who the movie Altered States?
Oh, Altered States, yeah. I know who you talk. I know the actors you're talking.
Yeah, that's going on at the university, right?
John Hurt.
Yeah. There's sensory deprivation tanks, right? So this was going on as well, where they would give soldiers a lot of LSD and then say, hey, stick him in the tank and see what he does, right?
Did they ever turn into a caveman? No.
Right. Biodome. Pretty much, I would say a kind of psychopathic attitude is the main point here on the part of these doctors and psychologists, psychiatrists that are the professor arm of this are extremely psychopathic, and they have no scruples whatsoever about experimenting on human beings. And the main dark figure in this regard would be Dr. Ewan Cameron, who comes out in Marx's book as the most notorious, where they were experimenting on blacks, they were experimenting on soldiers, they were experimenting on people in mental institutes, of people with drug addiction. And so it's under the guise of mental health, which is important because that, of course, plays a big role in, say, Obamacare, right? It's under the guise of mental health that a lot of this is going on, a lot of these psychiatric institutes. So scopolamine would play into this, which is, of course, the notorious drug that wipes out one's will, although that didn't work out well for the original intention of creating the couriers and so forth. But it's important that MK Ultra doesn't just connect with Tavistock and the LSD. It's part of the biowarfare department, right? So originally it was under biowarfare and wet works and that kind of stuff. And they even talked about and discussed aerosol spraying of these things. Now, we've all probably heard about the different declassified programs of the military spraying different cities as part of their biowarfare testing programs. But it's from this milieu from which MK Ultra arises as well. So special operations divisions, right, early people in the OSS, these are the people who are masterminding this. The ideas, I believe, they got from the British Royal Society and those nefarious cats like Huxley and Russell. So other elements do come in that you pointed out that we probably shouldn't touch on too much, just because that's everybody knows about the couriers and the altars and things like that. But these, according to at least these books, these are elements that were part of the studies. They did realize that in Project Bluebird and Artichoke that you could produce these schizophrenic states where people would have multiple personalities. And I've been around druggies, I've been around people in the drug scene before. I've done, in my younger, stupider days, some hallucinogens, and I can completely see how this would be possible, and you could have people emerging with split psyches, and in fact, Marx does even cite Huxley at one point in his book, talking about the splitting of the person's psyche, and this is page 113, where he cites Gordon Wasson, and then at some point in here, maybe we're just talking about Albert Hoffman, these different doctors who were involved in this. At some point, there's a quote from Huxley that touches on split personalities. I think it's page 119. And this is where we get figures like Tim Leary, who would be part of the hippie revolution to promote this to the masses. And they do this through their also, I believe, created counterculture, which Dave McGowan touches on in his Laurel Canyon book. And so I think that it's pretty solid in my view that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, electric Kool-Aid acid test. These are actually from the establishment to steer the counterculture in a certain way, ultimately to engineer society as a whole. So it really wasn't about anti-war or any of that. It was all about the mass control and brainwashing, on a mass scale.
Yeah, because we all have heard about the lurid stories, the Hollywood stories, the sexy stories about mind-controlled assassins, patsies, couriers, sex slaves, and these things. Well, obviously those did exist, but they're the ones that get to play. But behind all that is a much more ambitious and arguably more sinister agenda to manipulate and control society through whether mass drugging or just general mind control. Also mass trauma, because I think wasn't it Tavistock who observed from World War I shell shock?
Yes.
That you could break the psyche, and instead of trying to cure that, they weaponized it.
Well, here's a good quote from Wasson. He says, describing one of the trips, he says, they emerged from the center of our field of his trip. They emerged, these forms, from the center of the field of our vision, opening up as they came. Vivid in color, they were always harmonious. He talks about seeing art motifs, you might see textile patterns and so forth. But then he goes on to say that, could the miraculous mobility that I was now enjoying in the explanation for the flying witches that I saw play some important part in the folklore and fairy tales of Northern Europe? In other words, he's kind of hinting that, well, maybe folklore and folk tales come from people doing some sort of hallucination. Mm-hmm. These reflections passed through my mind at the very time that I was seeing the vision, for the effect of the mushrooms is to bring about a fission of the spirit and a split in the person's psyche, a kind of schizophrenia, with the rational side continuing to reason and to observe the sensations that the other side of the mind is enjoying. And I think that that's definitely the case. This is Project 58, which most people know as MK Ultra, because there were dozens of different projects based on different drugs.
And that was the famous Life magazine cover, correct?
Exactly, right. That's Gordon Wasson there. And then you have other quotes by, Wasson says it again, the very same thing about seeing other worlds and having his mind split and so forth. And then Marx goes on here to discuss Huxley's book Doors of Perception, which would deal with the same topic. And of course, Doors of Perception is where the Doors get their name. And if you remember, there's actually some interesting scenes in Oliver Stone's presentation of the Doors, where Val Kilmer is playing Jim Morrison. And if you think about that scene where they're out in the desert and they're like bouncing around, tripping, and Jim Morrison's like, I broke on through to the other side, man.
Yeah, it's. I remember when I saw that, I was like, "What's going on here?"
Well, that is the effect that LSD gives. It gives some people in the drug counterculture will call it solving the world, where you get this sense that, I'm spiritual now, I've transcended things, I've figured things out, I've solved the world, right? So then you come back from that and you kind of get I'm like the enlightened guru now. Mm-hmm. That is the effect that it gives, and I think that is the history of kind of indigenous religions and shamans, using these things, giving them that sense of thinking that they're quasi divine or whatever. And this is what we see in a lot of the cults. A lot of cult leaders, who do drugs, come back with this impression that they're divine, and that's what happens. A lot of people take these drugs and they come back and I'm God.
Yeah,
right? I think. Right, and so what when you get up into the Ewan Cameron section of the book, and this is the Mount Royal in Montreal, the facility where Ewan Cameron did his work, he took it to the next level of the patterning and the programming, and he said, oh, okay, actually the mind kind of works in this way where it's patterned according to Pavlovian operant conditioning and input response type stuff that we've all learned from childhood and so forth. And Cameron thought that what you could do is actually depattern a person and create a vegetable, he says. And the idea here was that you could return to the tabula rasa, blank slate of like John Locke and these different empiricist philosophers, that you could wipe the slate clean and start over, right? And I could see how he would think that, given what you witnessed in different people who've gone through these kind of drug trips and whatnot. There's an interesting series of videos the BBC did. I can't remember, the guy's name was Bruce Bruce something, I forget, but it was this show where they sent this guy, a complete idiot, to go and take the initiatory drugs of like a whole bunch of different tribes. This guy was a complete moron. This guy went through the initiation of like 15 different tribes of just like the worst imaginable drugs. I probably drove the guy insane, but assuming that this is real, the BBC didn't stage it all.
Yeah.
You can watch this guy go through these different rituals and through these different hallucinogens, and you'll see what I'm getting at, right? Because so when he goes through certain ones, he's like, oh, I feel one with everything, right? And so this is also, by the way, where sort of the New Age philosophy will emerge out of the hippie drug culture post 60s and 70s. But it's Cameron who really did the hardcore work on the idea of deprogramming, depatterning people's minds, and then what you would do is come along and repattern it and reprogram it with certain images and symbols and so forth. And I think this is probably where a lot of people get the whole Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland is all part of this, because the only thing that I could find directly connecting MK Ultra to like Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland is according to Marx, one of the students one of the test patients that Cameron was working on was this woman. I think she's unnamed, or they call her Lauren or something. But yeah, Lauren. Lauren went through the process that Cameron described as first step was that you go through memory loss, and it's also combined with electroshock, right? So electroshock was kind of in vogue in the 40s and 50s, and even prior to that. And you basically shock everybody you shock these people for 15 to 30 to 60 days while you're giving them LSD, you're torturing them. And first they have memory loss, then they have the loss of space-time relations, and then he says they lose all the anxiety and they become a vegetable. And then he says what you do is you come along with psychic driving, and this is that programming where the mind he thinks is blank, and then you play cassette tapes. This is curious because this is actually what we see in Brave New World, where they have what they call the hypnopedic chants, where everybody who goes to sleep at night after they take their soma listens to these hypnopedic mind programming cassette tapes. This also comes up, by the way, in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the Ian Fleming story with Bond, where Blofeld hatches this plot to brainwash these hot chicks under the guise of an allergy clinic through hypnopedic tapes at night. So that actually is, according to Marx at least, a Ewan Cameron hatched scheme.
And reportedly down at Guantanamo Bay, too, they do that.
Say what?
At Guantanamo Bay.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about Gitmo and Guantanamo Bay reportedly doing a lot of the same stuff. Exactly. That's a great point.
So, and that's the one where he sort of modified something like a football helmet or something. And
right.
Yeah. Jeez.
Now, to tie this into more big money, one of the universities where this was going on was McGill University, and this was paid for by Canadian Defense Force money and Rockefeller money. So this was one of the ones where they used the sensory deprivation tank on one of the test patients, and if you watch that first episode of The Twilight Zone, that's exactly what's going on. It's the military guy who's put under all these mind control tests, and they put him in a sensory deprivation tank, and he thinks he's gone back to his hometown, and you find out the whole time he's been in a sensory deprivation.
Oh, that's right. That's when the whole town's empty or something.
Exactly. Yeah,
That's
out of this sensory deprivation tank. But Cameron, what we get, the impression we get, is that he's just this complete monster. He views himself as God. According to Marx, he would even secretly dose his fellow MK Ultra doctor buddies. And that's just insane. I mean, you got to be charged for murder for this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
People, can die from this stuff. There's the reported case of Frank Olson, right, who was working with all these guys, and he supposedly leapt from the building. His family never got an answer as to what exactly happened, and if I recall, it was settled out of court by the government.
Yeah, his case was he apparently had some trouble with some of the things he saw go down.
Right.
One, I think, was a massacre of North Korean prisoners of war.
Right.
That were being tested on, then they were ordered to dig their own grave, and they were shot dead. And he started, I guess maybe making waves or expressing misgivings about this. And he was dosed at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of dosing each other seems to be like a trend among these guys.
Exactly, yeah. And if you've ever had a bad trip, that could be the worst thing ever. You can lose your mind. It's like it's Russian roulette with your mind.
And I did a show with James Corbett talking about the Manchurian Candidate, the movie,
right,
on his show, Film Literature New World Order.
Yes.
And one thing a point I made was one thing that's interesting in that movie is you see things that the communists are doing, like shooting people, having them shoot each other. That's what the CIA was doing with MK Ultra,
exactly.
right?
Well, that's the exact point that I was making in the analysis of Notorious by Hitchcock and North by Northwest, is that we're under the impression that it's only the Soviets and the Russians that use sex spies. Yet in both of those films, Cary Grant in Notorious plays the Romeo sex spy who seduces Ingrid Bergman and turns her into a sex worker. And it's Eva St. Marie, who's a sex operative in North by Northwest. Mm-hmm. So curiously, those films are actually portraying what the CIA too would do, right? It's not like the Soviets were the only ones.
Yeah, and I guess the Thorndike character, he's more sympathetic because he's supposedly decent. He's kind of roped into this thing, against his will. And he makes that. I think I put a comment on your website about that, how he says he finds out that I guess her name's Eve in the movie, Eve Kendall,
right?
Has to sleep with this Soviet spy, for God, King, and Country, I guess. Yep. And what's the actual exchange? He goes, which is, well, I guess
around town. He says something like that. Right?
Yeah, war is hell, even a cold one.
Yeah, that's it.
He said, right. Well, in this war, if women like her have to sleep with men like that, maybe we should stop trying to win these cold wars. The idea is you're losing yourself, you're losing your decency in winning this war. You're becoming your enemy, which is again, I think, a opportunist or meme right there. Because let's face it was RSI didn't need any help, in that endeavor. They were perfectly willing to do these things before, but it's a great exchange in there. But I think you made a comment about that, how he was. How the CIA was able to set up the press and put a picture in the newspaper in that movie.
Yeah, and then they stage his death, right?
Yeah. But that's one of those. That's one of my favorite Hitchcock movies.
Yeah, me too. I was like North by Northwest, that and Burger.
The best scene I like now is when he's in the study, doesn't know what's going on, and they think he's somebody else. The dialogue in that is so good.
Yeah, but of course, then there's always that weird relation to his mom, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, because he's a bachelor. That's right. Older bachelor.
And now I recall you mentioning the rumor of Cary Grant, and
yes.
What was the source for that? I couldn't remember where you had heard that.
Neil Sanders.
Okay.
He was talking there. It's a rumor. I mean, a lot of these things you don't know. I just made it. My point was. A lot of the problems with accepting these things is they fall in love with the image, the Cary Grant character, as opposed to the man. And so when they find something like that, like Cary Grant could be a deviant, a sexual deviant, they're not going to believe it because they know Cary Grant from North by Northwest.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, you made that point about Bob Hope, and
Yeah.
We saw the same thing with Sinatra, to bring this back to, as I understand, Sinatra was doing some spying too because of all of his mob connections.
Hmm.
And of course, it's Sinatra who is, a primary player in The Manchurian Candidate.
Hmm.
It's also interesting too that in both these Hitchcock films that we mentioned and in The Manchurian Candidate, this is prior to most anyone knowing that there was such a thing as MK Ultra. I've
Hmm.
always found that fascinating. So that's a great, almost golden example of predictive programming, or revelation of the method, whatever you want to call it, because nobody's heard of this program. And I think the Richard Condon novel was 1959, and the movie is 62 or 3 or something.
Hmm.
And so nobody knew about this stuff, and yet it's already being put into these books. Now, some people might think that that was kind of on purpose. I don't know, but regardless, these are realities that are figuring into fiction, and that brings me to one of the most curious aspects of Marx's book, which ties into Hollywood, and that is Flipper. Believe it or not, because there's
Yeah.
this kind of B movie, Day of the Dolphins, which is based on this one of the MK Ultra doctors, Mr. Lilly.
I remember it well. George C. Scott. Yeah.
Right. And so Lilly had this idea of maybe we could use dolphins, and this is part of MK Ultra. And what they wanted to do was to I got to read it because it's too good not to read. A scientist who worked in the CIA Navy program states that some of the dolphins were sent to Vietnam during the 60s and got out of their pens and disappeared, unheard of for being trained dolphin. John Lilly confirms that a group of the marine mammals stationed at Cameron Bay did go AWOL.
So long, and thanks for all the fish. No.
And they returned covered with attack marks made by other dolphins. So apparently the other dolphins attacked the CIA assassin dolphins. But it's they were like putting like pokers on their snouts or whatever. It was a really bizarre idea. They were trying all kinds of different stuff to see if they could train these.
Yeah. That
Dolphins.
that reminds me of the experiment with the cat, with the surveillance
Oh,
cat.
right, right.
Spend $1 million, and like first day test, it runs out in the street, gets hit by a car. Or something.
Well, he then goes on to talk about the defection of Yuri Nosenko from the KGB, and they think that the CIA, according to Marx at least, thought this might have some connection to Oswald, and so Nosenko was put into a whole bunch of a 12 by 12 vault, and it was not allowed to read anything or have any light, or they did all this kind of brutality upon him supposedly during his defection to see what would happen there. But
And that was just done this, not so much to get intelligence, just to see what the reaction would be.
right, and that's what
Yeah.
goes on to. There's an excellent chapter after that called Human Ecology, where he discusses sort of the ethics of the electrode implants, which according to Jolyon West and Sidley Gottlieb, this would be kind of where they would get into, and I think maybe Jose Delgado as well, who writes open books on mind control. I think he has a book, Hypnosis and Mind Control, by Jose Delgado.
Implants, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is where they get into the electronic implants, and this is because MK Ultra would also have a rough connection to the Manhattan Project, because the Manhattan Project is what would be the overarching chemical and biowarfare research that was going on at these different places like Fort Detrick and so forth. And so MK Ultra is kind of under that umbrella as well. And what you start to notice, especially when you read McGowan's books, and if you look at the research of some other people online, you'll notice that the Atomic Energy Commission, right, the Manhattan Project and all that didn't get shut down. It turned into the Department of Energy. And that's why at Oak Ridge facility, where the Manhattan Project was going on, here pretty close to me in Tennessee, that's now the NSA supercomputer facility under the Department of Energy. So, in other words, I'm just saying that the argument that I've been making all along is that it's not like it's this one instance of, oh, we've got this MK Ultra program over here. It's rather that it's all under the aegis of a complete full spectrum dominance approach to not just man, but man and his environment. And that's why I think Mark Hacker used the term for full spectrum subversion, which I thought was a good term, because under the guise of Cold War, which is when all this is going on, right? From this is post World War II on into throughout the Cold War, it's all, we've got to do all this because of the Soviets. We've got to do all this because of the Soviets. And then meanwhile, you've got, Anthony Sutton's work about, the Western industrialists, building up the Soviet Empire.
Yeah, funding the Soviet Union from the get-go.
Right.
And it's funny, you meant human ecology, or ecology exists. The Human Ecology Fund was a CIA front that funded Ewan Cameron's work, at least part of the work he did, yeah. So
we should point out too that this also will tie into DNA research, according to Marx in that same chapter, pages 162 and 63. He'll talk about they wanting to sort of sequence the genome, and this of course ties back to the Royal Society and Watson and Crick, and the reason I bring that up is because that shows that this is not just mind control; it's mind-body control and environment control is the whole thing. That's what they're concerned with. It's controlling the entire biosphere. And the electronic stuff that is mentioned, the implants and the electrodes and all that, hypnoshock, the shock therapy and all that Cameron would do, that's going to tie into where we get the notion of electromagnetic warfare, which is very real. Brzezinski mentioned it in Between Two Ages back in 72 or 73. And, we have that famous Michael Aquino PSYOP Psy-War document, Mind War Psy-War, where at the end, in the footnotes, he says explicitly that a huge part of what will be waged upon populace, right, not enemy combatants, enemy nations, but upon the populace, is electromagnetic warfare. Well, that is part of MK Ultra.
And you wonder why everyone has smartphones now, right?
Yes, and that gets to Dr. Schwitzgebel's machine, which if you do some research on Schwitzgebel, you'll find out that was not just a prison experiment, that Ewan Cameron got the idea of using this machine that prisoners would carry around on their ankles or whatever, that would relay information about their heart rate, their locale, and so forth, based on the idea of the panopticon prison system. But also, that is exactly what the Apple iWatch does, right? So in other words, that's an example of how public-private corporate government takes things from these private military government studies in culture and so forth, and then puts it out there to the masses. And we have the impression that, Sony is competing with Apple. And then they release it's like the exact same phone, right? I mean, like the operating system of Apple might be a little bit different from like a Sony, but and there might be there's a level of competition, but the hardware and the software is all coming out of the same military-industrial complex, and it's the same military-industrial complex who's doing Manhattan Project, who's involved in biowarfare research, who's doing the LSD, social engineering.
You want to get into mind control and just mind screwing. I've read. Are you familiar with Miles Mathis?
I am.
Did you read his article on Stephen Jobs?
No, I've read about 4 or 5 of them. And some of his stuff I think is a little just.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily.
But there's also insights there. Yeah.
It's food for thought. All of what we do is food for thought. I'm sorry, not like I can get a FOIA request or subpoena the documents and prove this stuff. That's not
even get the FOIA request. I mean,
but
operating on the principle that the government's going to be honest. Right?
Yeah, but I know he also wrote one of Fidel Castro that you might find interesting. But lifetime actor.
I pointed out that Castro's an actor.
Yeah, and he
has an IMDb page where he starred. I pointed that out many times. He was an extra in some films in the 40s.
And he just makes some ludicrous points regarding Bay of Pigs and how ridiculous how this why would they invade there when they had a huge base there they could operate from? But that's a whole other topic. But it is funny you mention this stuff. But when you mentioned something like the Manhattan Project, and of course it's retailed to the public as so this crash program to develop an atomic bomb to beat out the Nazis, so you can win World War II. Of course, it's much more than that. And there was a program, and you mentioned the Atomic Energy Commission, or the Department of Energy now. that became the Manhattan Project. But it's now known that under the Atomic Energy Commission did experiment on not only soldiers,
Yeah, with British.
but the general population.
Yes.
I think there was a thing, it was called Operation Green Run. They actually released radioactive iodine 131 was released over from the Hanford nuclear facility on purpose and sent over Spokane, Washington. And this is just to see what the effects would be.
Well, and this is because, and I think this is probably accurate. I mean, Marx argues in the close of the book that MK Search is what would take over for MK Ultra. So when there's investigations into it, right, and the government says, "Oh yeah, okay, you caught us. We'll stop now." They just move it to a different place and rename it. And this is where it comes under the rubric of chemical and biological warfare, and that's the argument that Marx makes, and he says that the chemical services that were offered were, well, he talks about the Freedom of Information Act that was had and so forth, and that all that happened was just moving it to a different locale, and so it becomes a focus on, this is what, according to him, is where the focus starts to shift over to RF and EMF research, and that's exactly what we see, in Aquino's Mind War Side War document.
And of course, when the, I guess it was the
they would cut off monkey heads and they would try to beam frequencies out of the monkey heads. This is what they were doing with your tax money, by the way. This is like, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars of tax money, and they're chopping off monkey heads like faces of death.
Yeah. The documents MK Ultra were all, most of them were destroyed, I think, in 1973 under the order of Richard Helms, I think Sidney Gottlieb, who destroyed the documents, then resigned, and I think went off to work in a monastery somewhere in the east, like in Asia somewhere, I think. Of course, what remained were those financial documents which John Marx used to write his book, and curiously, they survived. Now, that could just be good luck, or it could be because, as you alluded to earlier, that some of these books are limited hangouts, and even the people that are writing limited hangouts might be well intentioned.
Could be, yeah.
Because they can only do so much. I mean, if you figure I can only do this much, what else can I do? So it's not these people may not be sinister figures, but they are controlled.
Well, and it's important to point out too that it's from this same milieu of MK Ultra in these various programs and testing that we get Stanford Research Institute, and this is where we get the movements into the idea of what's in John Ronson's book.
Ministeric Goats.
Yeah, Ministeric Goats, and the whole idea of a First Earth Battalion, of creating those hippie special forces.
Yes. They were like, they could try to walk through walls.
Right, and so, but it's weird because of this. It moves into trying to jump into the realm of the occult, where they want to try to do ESP research and remote viewing, and that you can look up the actual white papers from Stanford on remote viewing. So that was all. How real that was, I don't know, but that was all at least a real attempts and real programs. And reportedly, I think Hacker translated a piece for Espionage History Archive that was talking about the Kremlin psychic spies. So both sides of this dialectic are doing all the same stuff, right?
Yeah. And so, is it ESP or intuition? I don't know. It's I heard someone tell me one time that the Asians tend to have better intuition than the Westerners, tend to be more rational. So that's interesting. Well, that's no fair because they're 14 hours ahead of us, so they obviously know things in advance, right?
Curious too that in this same chapter at the end, he talks about the idea of genetic modification and manipulation. This is the last few pages, and he says that this is kind of the outworking of where all of this logic goes. And he even talks about the attempt to create the super soldiers. Right now, I'm not sure that I think that there's literally necessarily a super soldier, but I think that you can see the idea here with we do have mainstream pieces from Wired and so forth where DARPA talks about their plans to create a super soldier.
Yeah.
And Marx does connect a lot of this to DARPA, and I think that's important because you start to see that DARPA is actually not disconnected from MK Ultra. It's the same mindset of the technocrat of scientism that man can be perfected, man can be recreated, changing images of man, that famous white paper.
Yeah.
That whole idea, and it stems back to MK Ultra, so that's why it's important.
That's right. You go almost. It's almost a form of alchemy, I guess you could
Oh,
suggest.
absolutely, I think so.
But you're not. We're not necessarily talking about like Dolph Lundgren here. We're talking.
Well,
Yeah.
somebody made a point. I forget what I was reading the other day, but they were saying, yeah, actually, Universal Soldier, that dumb movie with Van Damme and Dolph,
Yeah.
it's about super soldiers. I'd forgotten that, but that's actually what it's about.
Mm-hmm. Because there was a I saw a documentary on the first Earth Battalion,
Uh-huh.
and I think it was I think it was based on Ronson's book. It's a documentary. I know there's a movie made. There's also a documentary I could watch on YouTube. And there's one case where one of these soldiers thought that they could, I guess, meditate, and they could lie down and have a jeep drive over them, a vehicle, and he'd be okay. And apparently the guy drove over too fast, and he wasn't able to concentrate, and he killed the guy. So that's actually in the documentary. I was like, and they have that weird guy in Hawaii living in a mountain somewhere who's
Yeah.
I remember that some sort of a swami up there, but he's like a
It's
lieutenant
that we can borrow ideas from the yogis and
yeah.
tap into Buddhist monk techniques or whatever.
Which I think it could be just a form of mysticism and more confusion, and also people just a lot of free time on other people's money to spend, right?
Well, you got to put that earmark money somewhere, right?
Yeah, that's that's part of the phenomenon. You got so much money to spend, why not? So,
$800 hammers and $10,000 monkey head experiments, right?
mm-hmm. Or you can always say, we spent $10 million here, only spent $1 million, and steal the $9 million.
Take the rest of it.
Yeah, that's an old trick, So, but in your talk, of course, what we talk clear is under the umbrella of MK Ultra, they're doing a lot of these real brutal experiments on human beings, often unwittingly.
Mm-hmm.
But the sad thing is, one of the targets were children, because children were easier to, I guess, to create MPD or DID, dissociative identity disorder.
That is the storyline.
Yeah, and George Estabrooks, I think, wrote a memo to J. Edgar Hoover specifically about that very thing.
Right.
To deal with juvenile delinquents, I guess, supposedly.
Well, and curiously, to tie it back into Hollywood, it had been forever since I watched Willy Wonka. That was, as we said, Roald Dahl, right? And so, of course, been aware of Tavistock and the connections to Hollywood and all that, and the idea of social engineering through media. And Dahl was, of course, buddies with Walt Disney. And in Willy Wonka, what you have is this strange sort of, I've read, the idea was he was kind of supposed to be a Howard Hughes type character, but not exactly, just kind of a loosely that kind of person. What does he do? He recruits a bunch of kids and runs these crazy psyops on them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And of course, the story.
No qualms about killing them either.
That's right. It was just, you're watching, you're just laughing at it as you watch it, because it's in the context of a sort of a kid's story or a fairy tale. Yeah, and same with like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fleming's kid story, exactly.
And you always should make the same case regarding Wizard of Oz. Of course, that predate, and that's the story itself. I think, but it was the way it's adapted. But there's all types of imagery in that too, as well.
And that's directly out of Theosophy, right?
Yeah. And was it Frank Baum? I think wrote that.
Right.
Yeah. But as far as we have these experiments going on. Of course, it's all top secret, and it gets exposed in the 70s. And you have the hearings, and I mentioned before that all the records are destroyed except for the financial records. So we're never quite sure if it ever goes operational. We just have to infer from the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But you earlier you mentioned cults
Mm-hmm.
and their function and the ties of these cults to intelligence agencies.
Absolutely.
And one cult that brings to mind is, of course, the Jonestown.
Sure.
And the Jonestown massacre, which all the evidence suggests that it at least had intelligence ties. Jones himself was he was an itinerant preacher, broke, and all of a sudden in the early 60s he turns up with a lot of money and resources. He's able to travel, and there's a
And while he was in what was it, Brazil,
Yeah, in Brazil. Yeah.
he had these connections with Dan Mitrione, who
Yeah.
had the dark intelligence connections, and it's there that he was interested in candomblé, which is the sort of indigenous religious manifestation that's, I guess, quasi Santeria voodoo type stuff.
Hmm.
The idea being that what techniques, what religious techniques for manipulation could be derived from candomblé, and that's, I think, partly why his appeal was to blacks.
Hmm. Now it's funny. There's a Vatican document, or at least Catholic Church document, complaining about CIA funding of ministries in Brazil.
Right.
Like, hey, this is unfair. And of course, you get into things like World Vision, which is an evangelical missionary group which has
Yeah.
ties to intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
And Jones had ties to that, which World Vision has ties to Mark David Chapman and John Hinckley, the would-be assassin of Ronald Reagan, and of course Mark David Chapman, the one who was blamed for killing John Lennon in 1980.
Yeah, and isn't a evangelical missionary a great legend or cover?
Yeah, it's a great. Of course, missionaries have always historically been used for that, particularly in China with the Rockefellers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a standard cover. But with what's interesting, Jonestown, of course, he was able to attach himself to the political elite, particularly in San Francisco. He was named head of the Housing Commission by Moscone, the mayor of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of his friends were given jobs in the welfare agencies to give him access to a lot of these poor people that he eventually recruited or brought down to Jonestown while keeping their welfare payments, which is illegal. They left the country. But no one did anything about it. He was getting like $2 million a month in collective payments or something from social services.
Yeah, how did he
Yeah.
gadfly about so easily?
And he also turned out to vote for Moscone. So you see, there's a give and take here.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the Jonestown massacre occur, which some people think was like was some sort of mass mind control operation, and it was just a cleanup operation. And then a week later, Moscone is assassinated by this guy Dan White, who's a former police operative, and then he's a councilman or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then he commits suicide like 7 years later. But that connection, where you suggest that maybe that was kind of loose ends, or so they're cleaning things up.
Well, it's important that we keep in mind that a lot of these operations have multiple uses.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my view, like a lot of these big mega churches, they're not just spying on people, with like FEMA connections or whatever. They're also money laundering operations. I mean, we've seen this many times with these, big fake TV preachers. Jim Baker, they were laundering money. Jimmy Swaggart, did he just have a sex scandal, or was he involved? Anyway, I've seen articles at least alleging that Paul and Jan Crouch of TVN, that Paul Crouch had some kind of mafia connection, was laundering money, and the FBI was investigating him.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen this many times. I'm just making the point that it's not just like a mind control spy type thing. It can also be just a criminal operation.
The drug running, hit squad, wet works, drug running, yeah. And these groups exist because you can keep them at arm's length, and if something goes wrong, there's plausible deniability, like it's a crazy cult.
Absolutely. And of course, some of them actually do have like a mind control connection, and I would think things like Scientology or the Raelian type groups would have that kind of MO, and we could look at even the so-called investigative groups like NICAP and MUFON, which I think are also CIA run.
This is kind of where we get to the broader definition of mind control.
Mm-hmm.
How kind of MK Ultra mind control. This stuff is outside sort of this operative black ops stuff. It gets into this mass mind control manipulation of the news, of reality itself, and that's where you get into your forte, which is Hollywood.
Well, and I should mention too that a lot of you brought it up in a recent talk, maybe the interview that was done with you, and it's something I've talked about some, and that's the co-opting of the so-called conservative movement. Back in the '80s with Falwell and Moral Majority, and
oh yeah. Don't the Collins brothers get into that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can find a lot of the sort of the so-called right-wing CIA running a lot of that, back in the '80s, and bringing the Reaganites into this, like I said, the Moral Majority. And so you'll find the CIA, at Bob Jones University and places like that too.
Oh, that's like with I was reading Trento's book,
Yes, I have. Yeah, I have that book.
and
Sure.
Prelude to Terror,
Yeah.
and you realize a lot of these big conservative fundraisers have these intelligence ties, and that's how they, you realize how did they get so rich,
Exactly.
you know, and that's he has a title called 7700 Leesburg Pike, which is an office building near where I live,
Uh,
and that's the office of Richard Viguerie, who's a big fundraiser for the for conservative causes in the
uh,
70s and 80s,
okay.
and he's tied into South Korean intelligence,
Wow.
and you really get into some deep intrigue here, and basically, they at one level they act politically, but they're also uh, probably funneling money.
Exactly. That's the angle that I was trying to get at. That's
Yeah,
always involved in this kind of stuff.
they're laundering money. It's running money through the operation like that, and you
Well, see, if you think about Katy Perry, her dad is a big charismatic minister, and he's best buds with that South Korean megachurch pastor who got caught laundering I don't know how many millions of dollars out of the church. And when the church came to him and asked him why, he said, "Well, I was trying to fund my wife's K-pop career. She was trying to be a K-pop star, and she needed millions of dollars to get."
and that's also like the of course Unification Church, right?
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, well, it's Goonies, and that's directly to the Bushes and
Yeah,
Washington.
and and that's when you get into sort of this private intelligence network with this Safari Club and
Break Club, that's
yeah,
Joe talks about. Yeah, and that's interesting because that's a lot of times people think about what this idea of the right wing and the left wing. Yeah, it's a controlled dialectic, but there's also kind of a right wing and left wing within these intelligence operatives, right? So people would think of Gloria Steinem being this left winger, right? Well, she's working with CIA, right? And then you've got these so-called right wingers, right? Bush Senior, right? Well, he was head of CIA. I'm just giving those as
yeah,
examples.
yeah. Gloria Steinem is an interesting figure because she was the recipient of the Chester Bowles scholarship.
Which was, I think you argued, was just kind of, what is that?
It was literally given to one person, her, and never, because she went to Smith College, which is a real expensive elite college, and she came over.
Well, this is the idea of a made man, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The made man, and it's the Rockefellers who were involved in setting up the CIA from the outset, right? So it's not just British intelligence, but it's this same apparatus.
Yeah, the same corporate banking interest that
Wall Street, right?
Yeah. Prior to that, it was kind of informal, and basically what happened was in 1947, this incestuous relationship was formalized.
Yeah.
At least here in the States.
I'm sure you've seen the Hitchcock film Notorious.
Is that Gregory Peck?
No, that's the one with Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman.
Yeah, a long time ago.
I think it's 45 or 46. Well, it's interesting because that's part of the CIA, and he's this foreign operative, but he's not identified. So I'm wondering if he's supposed to be OSS because it never says what he is, but he's doing CIA type work, and OSS was formed I think 42. So I don't know. I always thought that was interesting that because I watched the film recently when I'm doing my Hitchcock analysis.
Well, yeah, that was formed, but largely under British supervision, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's the British Security Executive or something, or BSE or something. That was William Stevenson, the Intrepid or something. He was Canadian, right?
Yes, Canadian spy master. And then, did you know that Hitchcock? Well, I guess you read my article. I didn't know that he shot war propaganda films for the British Ministry of Information.
Oh yeah, him and also who's the other guy? Other director, Billy Wilder.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they went and they filmed a lot of the post-war stuff, a lot of the fake concentration camp videos that we all grew up on.
Which are admitted to be,
I know. It's like, yeah. I guess if you go to Germany, you get arrested. No, but yeah, it's Billy Wilder, Hitchcock, and of course you mentioned I read that in that Northwest article, his connections to what was the guy's name? Quarta?
Yeah, the Quarter Circle.
Yeah, the Quarter Circle. Yeah, and that get of course, in the run up to World War II, the British had pretty much Hollywood was their instrument.
Yeah, apparently there was this movement of anti-Americanism, or excuse me, anti-British America First movement.
Yeah,
and then it was Noel Coward and Ian Fleming and some of these characters, Hitchcock and Porta. Their goal was to alter the attitudes to be pro-British.
Yeah, and that's when you had movies like Gunga Din coming out.
Oh, okay.
I was watching just a movie. My kids were watching a Shirley Temple movie, and it's about. I guess it takes place during the Crimean War, and it's one of these hokey Shirley Temple movies. She's trying to find her father or something. I forget. It's made 1942, and Queen Victoria is this great woman, and the British are great.
Yeah.
It's like that's a war. That's a propaganda film.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I grew up watching North by Northwest. My dad liked Hitchcock, and it wasn't until the last time or two of watching it that I realized, oh, this is actually a Cold War propaganda film.
Mm-hmm. So,
anyway.
But we get into this broader idea of mind control, mind manipulation. What we're getting here is you mentioned. We had your quote here somewhere. You're talking about basically the media we imbibe, even the gadgets we use now, all part of pretty much creating I guess you could say, a comfortable electronic concentration camp.
Pretty much.
Yeah. But you have with
concentration camp of the mind.
Yeah.
Which Huxley said they would do.
But you have basically with the one good example of that was just what is the company InQtel.
Yes.
Which funded talk about social media, right? What's
right.
their role with social media?
Directly with Facebook and Google, and in Melissa Mala's deception book that she's a CIA operative who appears to be for some time was Angelina Jolie's handler for the film Salt. Mm-hmm. She wrote in her 2005 book that it's she kind of talked about beforehand. I mean, Facebook was relatively new at the time, but she was saying even back then that these are CIA funded things as a CIA person. So this is no conspiracy theory. This is 100% bona fide and true, even in mainstream sources. And if you read about InQtel, you'll find that again, even mainstream sources will cite a whole bunch of tech corporations that are CIA fronts and startups, including things like Paladin, and that would connect to Peter Thiel, Bilderberg, and so forth. So yeah, this whole apparatus has the appearance of free market competition, or so people think. Oh, I'm going to invent an app and I'm going to be the next big billionaire. But that's not really how it works, because what goes to the top is pretty much chosen, I would say, because we don't live in a market that's free. We live in a corporate private partnership that we talked about. And so those companies like InQtel will be in the background for getting something like Facebook going. And so the presentation that you get in the Social Network is not accurate in the movie, because that's only kind of hinted at the film that, somebody donated all this money, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that somebody is actually the CIA.
Yeah. And why would that one platform be so successful as opposed to others that were?
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
And same with Microsoft, by the way, and Apple, and that's why you get this idea that maybe Bill Gates and Stephen Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg are just kind of placed there from a marketing standpoint.
They're marketing. They're like this car salesman, like Obama.
Yeah, but it's almost like it's the same reason if you're going to market a instant cake mix, you need Betty Crocker's face, right?
Yeah, you need the nerdy tech guy.
Yeah, and the idea of him that's working in the basement and not having any
sweating away in the basement, typing out algorithms and not going dates.
And then his of course the I guess the counter to that would be Stephen Jobs, who's more suave and cooler, right?
Yeah, and he's part of the whole tune in, turn on, drop out, whatever the he's like, oh yeah, we just laid around and did some acid and come up with this stuff, man.
Um, but at the same time, you with all this stuff, you know, whether it's social media, it's you have smart everything, right? Smart cars.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I should add too. And so I've read or heard people that have done research. I haven't done a whole lot of research on Philip K. Dick, but well, one of the reasons he was so prescient in his science fiction novels was that he was apparently kind of hanging out in the Silicon Valley circles.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of knew where they were going to take things. So, you know, he wasn't reading a crystal ball. He was, you know, talking to the tech elite, and that's kind of it. In my view, it kind of ties into planet obsolescence. And there's a great documentary that the Hoaxbusters guys posted called "Light Bulb Conspiracy," and that shows just how far we are away from actual freedom in free markets or whatever, where you actually have plain obsolescence has been going on for a long time, like all the way back to the light bulb, when they realized that we shouldn't actually make light bulbs that last. We should make light bulbs that you know, go out after a few months, because then people come back.
Mm-hmm.
This extends all the way into the modern world with everything from printers to, you know, entertainment technology, whatever, because that, in other words, that explains how the really advanced stuff is kept secret, and is what we think are the new advanced gadgets are things that were invented, you know, 20, 30 years ago. So we know we hear this term, these phrases like, oh, they're probably 30 years ahead of us. But what I'm saying is that documentary actually shows how that happens in practice.
This goes back to the old issue of this occulted knowledge, and basically, if you can keep things secret, you can keep a step or two ahead of the general population and keep them enslaved.
Well, that's what Isaac Asimov encoded into his Foundation novel, because the scientific elite, you know, hide their secrets under a religion, as the what he calls it, the psychohistory, which is this algorithm that predicts mass movements and can predict, quote unquote, the future. But what it's doing is just predicting contingencies and likely outcomes through game theory and statistics. Mm-hmm. And so this is, of course, what John Nash and people at the NSA worked on, Rand Corporation, around game theory. But that's all very real. And so, oddly enough, back in the 40s and 50s, Asimov was pretty much writing Google. He's talking about the internet and Google. Mm-hmm. But all he's doing is taking the technological projections and know-how and kind of guessing about what could be had in the future, and it gives the appearance then of like being, you know, sort of magic knowledge or whatever. But it isn't. It actually is an occulted knowledge,
which is the old game, right? That's pretty much goes back to the Royal Society and the Freemasonry, and, you know, that sort of only the people within the inner rings are given the full truth.
The inner party that will. Yeah. If you read Lomas's book, Freemasonry and the World Society, he'll talk about all this stuff, and that is the hidden secret of the World Society. And what's interesting is that they have been in the forefront of promoting, I should mention, not just empirical scientism and materialism, reductionistic materialism, but also promoting the new agey side of quantum mechanics and quantum theory. Now, I happen to believe that there is truth to quantum philosophy and so forth. When we look at people like Werner Heisenberg, because Heisenberg says that the subatomic level of particles actually demonstrates platonic forms, which I think is accurate and true, as I've discussed in many philosophy talks. But if you read Lomas's book on Freemasonry and the Royal Society, he, at the end of the book, he gets to talking about how, now that we've seen that, you know, reductionistic materialism only goes so far, what we actually figure out is that, maybe the mind is what our own individual autonomous minds actually create and cause reality. So what I'm saying is that a lot of people in alternative media who are very critical of the quantum stuff they're correct in refuting and critiquing that mindset. But in my view, they're just part of a managed dialectic, because they're coming at it from the vantage point of crass, naive Enlightenment empiricism, which is just two arms of the same British lord.
And with empiricism, you get pragmatism and scientism.
Pragmatism and scientism, and
Yeah.
scientism is what gave us MK Ultra, because
Yeah.
the entire mindset of Tavistock and Huxley and all these people, well, maybe not so much Huxley, but especially Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells, is total atheistic scientism, hardcore. I mean, Bertrand Russell has countless works where he discusses this at length. But if you look at Huxley, there's a much more of a mystical turn there, where he has a book on the perennial philosophy, where he wants to promote his version of perennialism, which is essentially a kind of Masonic molding of all religions into syncretism and kind of ecumenism, to create these, the new age world religion of the future, which in Brave New World is this kind of civic religion where everybody participates in these orgies and liturgical dance. It's very Vatican II liturgy.
Clown masses.
It's very much a clown mass Anglican service,
And which is almost is the project of something like the World Council of Churches, right?
I'm not kidding. If you read Brave New World, it's a non-denominational sect.
Ecumenism in the name
It's
of world
total
peace.
ecumenical, non-denominational civic religion that kind of matches up with, say, Auguste Comte's creation of the civic religion.
It's the why can't we all get along appeal, which on the surface does sound nice, but then it gets in this sort of this globalist steamroller where everything has to be the same in the name of diversity.
Yes, and according to Malachi Martin in Keys of This Blood, it's the Rockefellers who put the money into the ecumenical movement, and that's also in the Rockefellers' authorized biography, where they have a whole chapter on that.
Mm-hmm. They want to do away with all distinctions, and that's also where you get into maybe perhaps some of this this refugee crisis or demographic warfare you see going on.
It's the exact same strategy in the religious realm as it is in the geopolitical national realm.
And because you could also say the destabilization that's occurring is, you could say it's a psyop, or
Yes.
which you could call mind control, I guess, but it is a psyop because they want to get people to react a certain way. And of course, if people react a certain way, then that can be, the reaction can then be weaponized.
It is, and that's the idea is that to break down all existing firewalls and boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just racial and locational; it's also ideological and religious. And so the way that you do that is things like a CC, where you have all the religions come together and under the sort of generic idea of, we're all just going to pray together in a CC chapel, and we're going to put cloths over the crucifixes so that we don't offend the voodoo practitioners, which is actually what happened at the 1986 CC, and then again in 2002 or so. I think they've done this 2 or 3 times now. Ratzinger even wrote a whole book where he criticized it in his book on tolerance. I think tolerance and something. I read it some years ago, but even he was critical of the ecumenical movement, although of course he then later participates in it, going to synagogues and so forth. So sort of a back and forth there, bureaucratic. What's exactly going on here? Is it bad or good, right?
Yeah.
In my view, and I'm not trying to attack Catholicism, I'm just saying because it happens in Orthodoxy as well. But you have the ecumenical patriarch, in my view, kind of coming under the control of Western intelligence, I would say.
Well,
he's probably a Mason too.
Yeah. Well, at Freemasonry, they say that Freemasons are infesting the Catholic Church, and that's an old.
Yeah, and they got into the Greek Church at the time, I think, of the Greek Revolution, and you started getting these patriarchs who had Masonic ties and affiliations, and Athenios or Nicodemus, one of the early patriarchs who changed the calendar, interestingly enough, which is what happened with the Novus Ordo Missae at Vatican II. You had, in both churches, you had a radical alteration of the traditional calendar and liturgy, which of course prepared the way for this ecumenism.
Yeah, there's interesting. I'm reading E. Michael Jones' book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit,
mm-hmm.
and there's a whole chapter on Freemasonry. He made an interesting point here. Let's see what you think about the modern world. I'm trying to break this off here. It's about Masonic lodges, and he says, before opening the lodge, Our beloved chairman congratulated the assembled fraternity on the long-hoped-for revolution in our dear country, because of which liberty, fraternity, and equality had now become the motto of our days. Furthermore, announced to the brothers that from now on all honorary titles were held to be abolished among us. When the brothers sang their Masonic songs, La Marseillaise, was first on the list. The lodge, however, had become unnecessary, because it had become the model of the new world, the modern world, which had adopted and would go on to implement its principles in its struggles against what was left of the Catholic order in Europe. That Masonic crusade would continue as nationalist Freemasonry of the Risorgimento conquered the papal states in Italy, and when the Masonic I guess that's a unification of Italy, and when the Masonic powers of American England would dismember Austria, the last bastion of Habsburg's Catholic Empire, following World War I. Both Wilson and Masaryk were the first presidents of Czechoslovakia, of the country. Wilson, carved out of the heart of the Austro-American Empire, were Masons. In each case, what began on the continent as a constitutionally governed society for gentlemen became a microcosm of the new secular, civic, yet quasi-religious political order we now have come to know simply as the modern world. Sorry for the long quote, but I thought that was a rather fascinating paragraph when I read that. What do you think about that? What do you get from that?
Well, yes. I spent a lot of time researching that very topic, especially in my 20s, and I think that's pretty accurate, especially when you look at it was the Masonic revolutionaries in Italy that had Pius IX walled up in the Vatican. And I was watching a movie not too long ago. What was it? And this actually comes up in the movie. What was it? It's some older movie. I can't recall, but there's actually scenes where you have the Italian revolutionaries are joyous about the fact that Pius has been walled up. And interestingly, Pius IX, when he in his younger days was a Republican, and he was actually had some revolutionary ideas. Mm-hmm. And by the time he was walled up in the Vatican, he realized that those revolutionary ideas probably weren't the best. So he had apparently a change of mind. And this is partly, I think, what was involved in the First Vatican Council. So you have to understand that, there's massive revolutions going on, not just in the church, not just in the social arena and in Europe and so forth, but in the church as well. And I find it interesting, though, that you look at the perspective of Masonry, they were not just interested in Roman Catholicism, although, of course, according to the Alta Vendita and Satis Cognitum of Leo XIII, and these different Catholic documents, they wanted to seize the papal throne and utilize it for the promotion of the Luciferian ideology. Mm-hmm. And according to there's a good book by I think an archbishop, Grand Orient Freemasonry, I think is the title of it. The name of the archbishop escapes me, but that's a really good book I read some years ago, where he describes this plot at length, and he's pretty accurate. What I find fascinating is that his whole thesis, based on Leo's Satis Cognitum, is that what they would teach is Scientism. So when you see Scientism as the norm, you'll know that the Masonic Revolution has been successful, at least in their minds. And that's exactly what the idea of the Royal Society was all along. And so, in other words, we're not dealing with different entities, we're dealing with the same conspiracy here. And so, I'm not saying that like Freemasonry literally runs every single thing in the world, but there is definitely that Masonic component. And Leo characterizes it as the rival to the church precisely because of its international character. Mm-hmm. And so it's able to have that subterfuge in all nations and governments. And so many of the revolutions, the last couple of centuries were Masonic, all the way back to the French Revolution. It was people involved in Illuminism. The ideas of Weishaupt were communism. And so a lot of Freemasonries had that tinge of communism, especially the Italian and the French Grand Orient Lodge teachings were, explicitly communistic. The Third International was involved in promoting suffrage and women's rights. And so you have to understand that we're living now in the context not of just some, Carroll Quigley 20th century conspiracy on the part of the Atlanticists, but we're dealing with something that goes back much further into, I would say, bloodlines. If you read Craig Heimbichner's book, Blood on the Altar, about the OTO, he argues that the goal to infiltrate the church and Christianity and religion as a whole was ultimately to dethrone it, to bring in a satanic age. And he actually cites, many of the ceremonial magicians like Crowley and people like that who, explicitly say this, right? So, according to Heimbichner's thesis, it's not just like a Masonic revolution to promote, scientism and reductionism, but amongst that inner party, that it's more Luciferian.
And I think you were recently on Clyde Lewis's show, and he made the point about he said he was talking to someone about the New World Order, and he says, "What am I going to do? Quit my job and fight it?" And he said, "No, you're going to do nothing, because guess what? You just become accustomed to it. You adapt to it." And that's kind of like what they've done. You could say that's what Freemasonry has done. They've changed society. And you can
Agents of change, yes.
Yeah, and you can also, I guess you could say it's kind of like what the cultural Marxists did, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, because Marxism ultimately is connected to Grand Orient Masonry.
Yeah, and of course, there's no, I guess it's not a coincidence that, of course, May Day is also the founding day of Illumina, right? The Illuminati. And
it's also like a Walpurgis night. It's also a high satanic day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important in the occult as well. And if we trace back Masonry and then the English Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England, and all that, what you get back to is, excuse me, you get back to Rabbi Lowe of Prague, and you get these kind of Kabbalistic ideas of the Renaissance era and Neoplatonic ideas of people like Marsilio Ficino, Cornelius Agrippa, Pico della Mirandola, and their idea was this, the Renaissance humanism could sort of cure the excessive medievalism of the Western papacy and so forth. And so what happened is you just kind of have this long train of ideological movements and thoughts that, in my view, kind of coalesce in these epochs, right, of scientific Protestant Reformation, scientific revolution, Enlightenment, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all outworkings of kind of the same ideology, ultimately, that I think is kind of satanic.
And the Enlightenment project, would you say was that like an Illuminist project, or?
Yeah, because if you look at these main characters like Diderot, Voltaire, and then the empiricists and so forth, Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Although Berkeley, I guess you could kind of count him out of there because he has a weird philosophy that's empirical but idealism, and he thought at least that he was a kind of Anglican theological savior to religion with empiricism. But anyway, nobody cares about Berkeley. But for the most of these people, it's an ideology of rationalism. But curiously, rationalism ultimately kind of folds in on itself and becomes, according to even Peter Gay, who's an Enlightenment scholar, he has an excellent book called The Rebirth, Enlightenment, The Rebirth of Paganism, or the Pagan and Enlightenment, something like that. But he's a Princeton or Yale scholar or something like that, where he discusses how it's actually kind of just the rebirth of ancient paganism. And I think that's ultimately accurate, because for people like Rousseau or these or Marat, Robespierre, Danton, these different revolutionaries and the ideologues that behind, say, the encyclopedists, as they're called, the philosophes, they have this outward veneer of rationalism, but I would argue kind of at the center of it is a kind of something dark and Luciferian, which is just the idea of the ascent of man.
Well, the rationalism ended in the terror. So
exactly.
Yeah. So, and
these guys, a lot of those guys were hardcore members of lodges, like Marat.
Mm-hmm. And that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that was largely a British project, right? Targeting France.
I think that thesis does make sense. Yeah.
Because of course France had a Catholic monarch.
Exactly, and they was able to get rid of Louis. And then I guess maybe some deal was made, right? Because didn't the Dauphin go to England?
Yeah, escaped to England, and then of course even Napoleon.
They seek him here, they seek him there.
That's a whole other British interpretation of the French. Yeah, that's no the Scarlet Pimpernel. But even Napoleon was a Mason because he was eventually expelled from the Masons. So
Exactly. And I've had some interesting debates about what exactly was going on with Napoleon. Isn't it interesting that the revolution goes from being this egalitarian liberty, equality, fraternity thing, and it turns into this imperial idea of Napoleon, and then Napoleon
he's enthroning himself. He takes the crown from the Pope, right?
Exactly, and I understand for a time he flirted with Islam, and Islam has an interesting, I would argue, easy coalescence with Masonry, and so we see a lot of Masonic intrigue and subterfuge, involved with Islam, particularly in the British flavors of Wahhabism through. The early founders of the Muslim Brotherhood, many of whom were Masons.
And of course, the British were deeply involved in that operation.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That so if the Grand Lodges in England, the Masonic lodges of the Muslim Brotherhood would be a great way, not just to inculcate ideology, but to pass secrets.
Yeah, it's a model of subversion and also just networking and subversive networking. It's sort of
I believe it was Al-Banna and Ibn al-Dudi. These guys were all part of like the same lodge, and they secretly viewed religion just as a joke, but were merely involved in the great game power politics aspect of it.
And of course, a lot of these ideas, of course, traveled across the ocean and influenced the founding of the American United States. With we had Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin.
So-called right-winger revolution of the nobles of like Lafayette, right? So you had different ideas in the French Revolution of the Jacobins or the far left communists, the Weishaupt influenced types, and then you have the so-called right-wing Girondins and the idea. So my professor told us, right? The idea of right and left actually comes from the provisional government of the Republic that set up in a tennis court.
Yeah. Tennis court oath, yeah.
And you have so the Girondins sat on the right side of the tennis court, and the Jacobins sat on the left, and so that's where we get right and left in politics. But they're both different flavors of revolution. but of course the Girondins being kind of the merchant and nobles rebelling against the monarch, they still wanted private property.
yeah, that's right.
They stood to lose quite a bit if they were Jacobins. So you can see then why the American founding fathers, with our founding documents, of course, retaining, that British influenced ideas of Locke, right, in the ideas of maintaining private property.
And and then of course there's revolutions that they start. I guess you could argue kind of get out of control. At some point, and
the revolution in Mexico was Masonic as well.
This was the one in the they kicked out the French.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Here's another to clarify the issue. This is out of E. Michael Jones' book again. It says to clarify the issue, the revolution was part conspiracy and part nature. The systematic subversion of morals the philosophes carried out in the name of enlightenment explains how one part leads to the other. The subversion of morals led the French to the point where passions would careen out of control into revolution. Ideas.
By the way, I don't mean to. Sorry to interrupt. Rousseau actually talked this way.
Mm-hmm. But he makes the point that Whigs were very conservative at home, but they were revolutionaries abroad.
Well, that's a British. Yeah,
the British strategy, yeah. But they get and with the British get the British Freemasonry, which operates I guess throughout the 19th century. Of course, some say it played a part in the outbreak of World War I because of their role in the Balkans.
With the Black Hand.
With the Black Hand, and that's the old It's the old strategy with the with the Mackinder Doctrine. How do you get Russia and Germany to destabilize each other?
Yeah. Did you ever see the newer presentations of the Guy Ritchie Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law?
I saw the first one. I didn't see the sequel.
But interestingly, if you watch the second one, it references all that.
Oh, really?
So you have Moriarty, the British professor, who's actually running all of the anarchist movements. And then the climax of the film is right up to the point of it doesn't explicitly show the Black Hand, but it's right before there's going to be the assassination of the Archduke.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Because, yeah.
And isn't it interesting that it is the British professor who's, I think we're supposed to think Moriarty is, kind of a British establishment guy.
Yeah.
And it's Britain who's going to, Moriarty, quote unquote, Britain who's going to profit from World War One.
I have to check that out. Well, who was it? Remember, it was the book The Secret Agent?
By Conrad?
Yeah, isn't he like a...
Yeah, it's the anarchist, right. And
Yeah.
the photographer, anarchist guy, right.
And that's like 1900, right? He's writing in 1900 or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, so...
And a lot of people pointed that out, and the connections to World War One. And yeah, you've got to watch Game of Shadows, I think is the second one, but it references all that.
So it's British intrigue in the Balkans starting, and the idea is to start a war so they could knock Germany down a peg or two. Is that the idea?
Yeah, Germany had been too strong.
Yeah.
Right, and England being Protestant since Henry VIII, you would have a threat from Catholicism in Germany and any Catholic monarchs, and we would be presumably, at least to appearances, allied with the papacy.
Mm-hmm. That's gotta check that out. So basically, we're talking about a philosophical corruption here with the Enlightenment, Scientism, and in that talk you gave, take it back to MK Ultra, kind of wandered off that, but you gave an interesting conclusion about that. A lot of these crimes were justified because of a philosophical corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to close out on that sort of observation?
Yes, and it is the ideology of empiricism, and we can trace that all the way back to excuse me, the debates that Anselm had, and so Anselm was arguing with nominalists in his day, and I have a piece that I wrote. It's kind of an Eastern critique of the ontological argument, but I still like aspects of the ontological argument. But so you have, even in his day, sort of the birth of this of nominalism, and nominalism is the philosophical idea that there's no essences out there in the world, and really all that exists are objects with these secondary qualities of solidity, right, and extension, size, shape, color, whatever. And then they might have atoms making them up, but that's it. There's no Platonic forms. There's no ideas in the divine mind. We don't know anything about any of that. That's all a bunch of medieval gobbledygook. What we know is what we get from our five senses, and that's it. Now, this is a preposterous philosophy. Plato dealt with people who believed this back in his day, called the Sophists. Aristotle did as well, even though I would argue Aristotle's kind of the beginning of this error. And it's the idea just that all that we know and all that there is what's brought into our five senses, and that's it. And so you can see quite clearly how this would pretty quickly lead to atheism, because you don't see or experience God himself, and therefore you don't have no reason to believe in anything beyond what you see and touch. Now, to people who first hear this, when you get your philosophy 101 course, this sounds like wisdom, right? What's the proverb that the first a man appears to be wise until someone comes along and examines him? We find out quite clearly, pretty quickly, that this is a pretty preposterous philosophy, and yet this, believe it or not, is the dominant philosophy of the entire world in our day. Most people believe in basic empiricism and scientism, and this, from the time of Anselm and his opponents at the time of the Middle Ages, early and late Middle Ages, up into Aquinas and so forth, this begins to gain more adherents, and so you have the nominalists that influenced Luther. Gabriel Biel was a famous nominalist who influenced Luther's philosophy, and then into Protestantism and so forth, it becomes kind of the norm to take this empirical approach in theology and philosophy. I would point out, too, a really good book that I picked up recently that I've been reading is by an Eastern theologian by the name of Demetrius Staniloae. And in the first chapter, he has a great critique of this perspective. His book is Orthodox Dogmatics, and it's volume 1. And he talks about how, in the Eastern perspective, there's never been this idea of natural revelation and supernatural revelation as sort of two competing but touching spheres, and that's kind of the foundation of Thomism. And so he presents the different perspective from the East that many would argue, many Eastern theologians would argue, is why the East never had these revolutions. Now, that could, some people might argue that's a good thing, some people might argue it's a bad thing, but you didn't see in Eastern Christianity these successive revolutions of, scientific revolution, enlightenment, and so forth, Protestant revolution. And many, you might argue that, well, that's just in a Spenglerian sense because of Western Faustian man. Whatever. Point being is that the origins of this mindset, this ideology of empiricism, have their kind of go back to you could trace it back to some of the Greeks, and then into medieval philosophers that Anselm opposed, and then into late medieval philosophers like Gabriel Bile. And then you get the full flowering of this idea of nominalism in empiricism. And empiricism is directly from nominalism. I should also point out that Immanuel Kant was very important in promoting empiricism, because he thought that David Hume's empiricism could never, ever be refuted. And curiously enough, there have been plenty of philosophers, even in the West, in the continental tradition, European tradition, who have argued and refuted empiricism. But the entire Royal Society establishment of academia has promoted it for, I don't know how many hundreds of years. And so nobody can seem to get out of this malaise of empiricism. And so we are under the false impression that because we have iPhones and technology everywhere, that scientism just must be true because it gives us iPhones, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is an important distinction that a lot of theological writers make. That's an error, and that error is to think that there's a difference between technical science or engineering science or operational science and origins science. These are two different fields, but people in the mass make the error of confusing the two and thinking that because we have engineering science or operational science, that therefore we can turn around and say, oh, that means Darwinism. Now that sounds stupid maybe to me and you, but this is what most people think. They think, oh, Darwinism and scientism, yes, because of iPhones.
Is that the similar distinction between speculative Freemasonry and operative Freemasonry?
Interestingly, you probably could make that connection, because I argued that a lot of the people in the Royal Society and these different groups, I think they know that reductionist materialism is complete baloney.
Because the Royal Society was a Rosicrucian Freemason origin, right? Didn't it start from that?
From their own mouths, yes.
Yeah. So it's a cult. It's controlled information. It's occulted knowledge, right?
Yes, and this is, I think, Edward II. No, that's the British. That's the Braveheart King. One of the Edwards, Edward the sixth or seventh. I forget the numbers, but he was sort of the first patron who put the money into this idea of the Royal Society. And then you have Robert Flood. Robert Flood was a magician.
There you go.
And here he is. Elias Ashmole is another one who's into ritual magic, and they're going to start the Royal Society, and it's all going to be about scientism. And this is what you get. This is and of course their darling Newton, right? And everybody knows about Newton, but nobody knows about Leibniz. But he's a much better philosopher. And so my correction to this, I would direct people to, this is one of the best essays I've read in a long time, if you can get your hands on it, and it's by a guy named Titus Brookhart, who is a Catholic and writes in the perennial tradition. I would not class myself as a perennialist, but I think they have a lot of good insights, people like Guénon, and I much prefer Dr. Philip Sherrard, who's a much better theologian, I would say. But Brookhart has an excellent essay that you can obtain in the book Sword of Gnosis, and this is I got an old copy on Amazon, but it's edited by Jacob Needleman, and the title of the book is Metaphysics, Cosmology, Tradition, and Symbolism, and it includes pieces from René Guénon, from Catholic philosophers, maybe Sherrard's in there, I can't remember, but a whole bunch of different essays that are really good. But Brockhart's excellent essay is called Cosmology and Modern Science, and what he does is he says, I'm going to critique science. It's the best critique of scientism I've ever read, and I've read a bunch. And what he does is he says, I'm going to look at ancient cosmology no, he's not flat Earth or anything, but he says, I'm going to look at ancient cosmology and show how that perspective on the world and on life makes much more sense than Darwinism and scientism and reductionism. And it's just an excellent essay, which he critiques what he calls transformism, which I guess in his day that was kind of the norm for Darwinism, because it's so irrational. There's no reason to believe in these transitions, which have to make absolutely no sense between species. And there's absolutely no evidence for these except for the CGI created creations like Tiktaalik. And so here's, he's just a great, he's, like I said, he's a Catholic guy. It's a great critique of scientism. And he just points out all the just basic philosophical nonsense behind scientism. One of the classics that I always bring it back to make it simple for listeners is, the idea of scientism is that the scientific method can pretty much answer and explain or give us the best approximation of whatever there is in the world that exists that matters at all. It could pretty much answer anything. But the problem with that is that scientism is based on empiricism. And empiricism says that we can only know what comes through, the five senses. And the problem there, from the outset, absolutely contradictory, is that empirical knowledge doesn't show us that the scientific method is true. I mean, the scientific method is something that goes beyond sense experience. It's an idea, it's a principle, a maxim, a starting point.
It's a useful tool, a bad paradigm.
It is, right? And many other things can be listed too, like mathematical entities. You can't empirically see the number 7. I mean, you might see an instance of it, but that's not the same thing as the number 7. But so there's all kinds of things like this. We don't experience the self, right? And actually, in modern philosophy, if you go to university and you start taking upper level philosophy classes, you'll get into, you'll take a philosophy of mind class, and then you'll learn that all the modern philosophers are trying to figure out how, if we're reductionistic, materialistic bunches of atoms, there's a mind. So that's how absurd modern philosophy has become, is that they're debating, using their minds to debate how there's a mind when we're just matter. It's that preposterous. And Bruckhart just does an excellent job in demonstrating how absurd that is. And I would even, consider, he makes an interesting point for geocentrism. And, over the years, I've read quite a bit of Robert Sungenis's works. And I think Sungenis actually makes some interesting cases for geocentrism. There's also another writer, I think it's Wolfgang Smith, who is very similar to Titus Bruckhart, and Wolfgang Smith's book Cosmos and Transcendence is excellent as well. Just complete annihilation, devastation of scientism.
It makes you rethink the whole Galileo affair, right?
Yeah, Sungenis made those arguments a long time ago, and I was a traditional Catholic at the time, and I remember reading all that, and I was like, man, this is a completely different picture from what I got in my mainstream science classes in college.
Well, yeah, which is all probably Royal Society, Black Legend stuff, right? So
it is, and by the way, if you read Lummis's book on Freemasonry and Royal Society, that's how he presents it. It's like this, their whole catalog of saints, right? Newton, Galileo, the saints of reason and science.
It's like I was reading, Darwin on Trial.
It's a great book.
Very good, good primer. Because if you're not real, but basically he trains a Philip Johnson.
Philip Johnson,
yeah. He uses a lawyer's logic.
Right.
He just takes it apart. He there's one part in it where he describes a meeting of paleontologists. I think it's the Philadelphia Museum, Natural Science, I think, if I recall from the book. And they have all these fossils, and they're treating them like icons.
Which, as Chris Kendall over at Hoaxbusters has pointed out so excellently many times, is that the way that it actually works in practice is that they're just finding bones and then they're giving it an interpretation.
Yes.
They're saying, oh, here's a bunch of bones. Oh, that's this strange monkey bird creature here, right?
Yeah. And all Darwin is it's Darwin was it's sort of a crude form of it's a 19th century crude form of comparative anatomy. And
yes,
I mean,
that's what homologies break down. And Ernst Haeckel, who was one of the premier figures in the homologies, was caught faking those.
Yeah, which gets back to our old mind control stuff, right? Fake media. Here we go again. Full circle. And I was at a movie this weekend. Decided to go see a matinee, and the end credits. This might I don't know if you're aware of this, but the visual effects is a company called Psyops.
Wow. No, I'm not, but I'm not surprised.
It's in the credits of the movie. Visual effects by Psyop.
Right. Well, I would just like to stress again, and just really, really excellent pieces I've read lately is Cosmology and Modern Science by Titus Brockhart is a must-read essay. It's about 60-page essay, and then Wolfgang Smith's Cosmos and Transcendence. Those are just premier critiques and nuclear annihilations of scientism.
Is this available on the net?
No, both would have to be purchased in book form.
Okay, so
but they are available.
The 60 pages. Okay.
I've not been able to find either of them online.
So, well, listen, I knew this is how I wanted the conversation to go tonight, because I just didn't want to do a recapitulation of MK Ultra, and
Yeah, there's
there's enough of that out there. I just want to get kind of. I know you've done a lot on it, and you've discussed the philosophical nature of it, which was scientism and naturalist reductionism, which justified all these horrible things of this view of nature. And also it goes to the idea that they can actually they can break down man and remake him, sort of this alchemical enterprise, and how they just no respect for the transcendent or for the creator himself. So
Philip Schreier has a great essay on he calls it unified science, and he's talking about how there has to be a return of the sacred to the natural world, because it's been desacralized since the time of the Enlightenment, scientism, and that's really, I think, the chief sin of these people is the desacralization of nature, because nature is supposed to be sacramental. And Schreier has an excellent essay. He also has a great talk.
Doesn't natural law kind of suggest that, following natural law? Would you say?
It is, right.
Yeah,
but there's just a bit of a distinction. Like I said, I would highly recommend Demetrius Staniloy's essay in Orthodox Dogmatics, where he talks about the distinction between natural and supernatural, and that natural law is essentially divine law. And I know that technically speaking, it wants to agree with that, but point being is that Schreier's essay, A Single Unified Science, is a great critique of that, as well as his talk on YouTube, Presuppositions of the Sacred. That's a really excellent talk, which is at Jay's Analysis, by the way.
And if you want to get into some of the details of the MK Ultra experiments, you have that YouTube that I'll link to.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That would I do have a talk on that. That is a subscription-based talk, which I would please subscribe.
So I'll link the link. I know you have the half video that's out there.
Right.
Yeah. So then you get the whole thing. Yeah. So, well, listen, anything else you want to say tonight, Jay? Before I let you go. I want to add.
That's it. It was a great talk, and I'd like eventually for you to come on Jay's Analysis, and we'll do a 2-hour half and half thing.
Oh, okay. Well, great. I'd be happy to come on board. Just tell me what you want to talk about. So no. So
I'd like to get into a lot of these sort of intrigues that you know about, like Hollywood Mafia and Cotton Club, and these kinds of dirty operation type things are pretty neat.
Oh yeah. Just if you want to do that, just give me some time, because I gotta get all the names.
Right.
I get the names confused. It's almost like you just have like trading cards or something.
Flashcards for.
It's like MK Ultra doctors. Keep them, get them all names.
Monsters. With Jolene last time.
Yeah. Well, that's what kind of like what like Richard Grove does with the brain model.
The brain, yeah.
Yeah, which is almost like what a prosecutor would do if he's building a conspiracy case. That's what you got to do with these things. So, well, great. Okay, yeah, just whenever you want to do that, just get in touch. We'll do that. That'd be great.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
Listen, I'll wish you a good night. I'm glad you're feeling better.
All right, thank you.
And good night. Thanks.
Bye.